The moment someone decides to leave Windows or Mac OS and finally enter the world of Linux, one giant question immediately appears. Which Linux distro should you actually choose? And in 2026, this question is more important than ever because Linux has evolved into something completely different compared to a few years ago. Gaming is better, hardware support is stronger, AI tools are deeply integrated, Wayland is becoming the new standard, laptops are getting more Linux-friendly, and distributions are now competing aggressively to become the perfect operating system for both beginners and power users. But among hundreds of Linux distros available today, 4 names dominate almost every discussion online: Pop_OS, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and Fedora. These 4 distributions have become the kings of the desktop Linux world. But choosing between them is not as simple as it sounds because each one targets a different kind of user, offers a completely different experience, and solves different problems. Some are designed for absolute beginners. Some focus on developers, some focus on stability, while others chase the newest technologies before everyone else. And that is exactly why in this video we are going to compare all 4 major Linux distributions in the most realistic way possible to finally answer one massive question. Which Linux distro is actually the best choice for 2026? Let's start with Ubuntu because, whether Linux users love it or hate it, Ubuntu remains the face of desktop Linux worldwide. Created by Canonical, Ubuntu has spent years building one of the biggest ecosystems in the Linux world. Almost every tutorial online supports Ubuntu. Most Linux software officially targets Ubuntu first, and many beginners choose Ubuntu simply because it feels like the default Linux operating system. But Ubuntu in 2026 is very different from the Ubuntu people remember from years ago. The operating system now focuses heavily on Wayland, AI-enhanced workflow features, better laptop battery optimization, improved gaming support, and deeper cloud integration. The GNOME desktop environment used in Ubuntu has become smoother, faster, and more modern, and Canonical has polished the overall experience significantly. But Ubuntu still remains controversial because of one thing: Snap packages. Canonical continues pushing Snap as the future universal packaging system for Linux, and many Linux users still dislike it because some Snap apps launch slower, consume more disk space, and sometimes feel less integrated than native packages. However, Ubuntu has improved Snap performance dramatically over recent releases. On modern SSDs, many users barely notice the delay anymore, and for beginners, snaps actually solve many dependency problems automatically. Ubuntu also shines in hardware compatibility. NVIDIA drivers are easier to install than ever, Wi-Fi drivers usually work out of the box, printers are detected automatically, and laptops from brands like Dell, Lenovo, Asus, and HP generally run Ubuntu without major problems. This matters because many people trying Linux for the first time simply want their system to work immediately without opening the terminal every 5 minutes. Ubuntu is also incredibly strong for developers. Docker, Kubernetes, Python environments, AI frameworks, web development stacks, virtualization tools, and cloud software all work beautifully on Ubuntu. In fact, many professional developers still choose Ubuntu because enterprise Linux support often starts there. If you search online for how to install something on Linux, there is a very high chance the tutorial uses Ubuntu commands. That massive ecosystem gives Ubuntu a huge advantage over almost every other distro. But Ubuntu is not perfect. Some users feel Canonical controls the project too aggressively. Others dislike the GNOME customization decisions Ubuntu makes. Some complain that Ubuntu can feel heavier than lighter distros. And advanced Linux users sometimes prefer more minimal systems without Canonical's design philosophy. Still, there is no denying one thing: Ubuntu remains one of the easiest and most reliable Linux distributions for beginners and professionals alike in 2026. Now let's move to Linux Mint, the distro many people call the true king for beginners. Linux Mint has built its reputation around one simple idea: make Linux comfortable, stable, familiar, and frustration-free. Unlike Ubuntu, Mint avoids radical changes and focuses on consistency. The first thing many Windows users notice after installing Linux Mint is how comfortable everything feels. The Cinnamon desktop environment looks traditional in the best possible way. There is a taskbar, application menu, system tray, easy settings, and a workflow that immediately feels familiar to anyone migrating from Windows 10 or Windows 11. That familiarity is a huge reason why Linux Mint exploded in popularity. In 2026, Linux Mint continues focusing on simplicity and user experience, rather than chasing experimental technologies. The distro remains extremely stable because it is based on Ubuntu LTS releases, meaning users benefit from Ubuntu's massive hardware compatibility and software support, while avoiding some controversial Ubuntu decisions like aggressive snap integration. In fact, Linux Mint actively blocks snap by default, preferring Flatpak support instead. Many Linux users love this decision because Flatpaks often feel more community-driven and desktop-friendly. Performance is another area where Mint shines. Linux Mint runs surprisingly well even on older hardware. If someone has a 5-year-old laptop struggling with Windows 11, Linux Mint can make that machine feel alive again. RAM usage is low, CPU overhead is reasonable, and the Cinnamon desktop has become smoother with every release. Mint is also famous for its update management system. Unlike some bleeding-edge distros, Mint carefully protects users from risky updates and system-breaking surprises. That makes it ideal for people who just want a computer that works every single day without drama. Gaming support on Linux Mint is also much better now. Steam installation is easy, Proton compatibility continues improving. NVIDIA drivers are simple to install, and many gamers enjoy Mint because of its stability. However, Mint does sometimes lag behind Fedora and Ubuntu when it comes to the newest Linux kernel versions or cutting-edge Mesa graphics drivers. That means users with extremely new hardware may occasionally get better support on Fedora or Ubuntu first. Still, for most people, Linux Mint provides one of the safest and smoothest Linux experiences available today, but Mint also has limitations. Some users think the desktop looks outdated compared to more modern GNOME-based systems. Others want newer packages faster than Mint typically delivers. Developers working with bleeding-edge AI tools or experimental frameworks may sometimes prefer Fedora or Ubuntu because Mint prioritizes stability over freshness. Yet despite those criticisms, Linux Mint remains arguably the best distro for total Linux beginners in 2026 because it minimizes frustration better than almost any other operating system. Now we arrive at Fedora, the distro many Linux enthusiasts secretly love the most. Fedora has a completely different philosophy compared to Ubuntu or Mint. Sponsored by Red Hat, Fedora acts as the innovation playground for enterprise Linux technologies. New Linux features often appear in Fedora long before they reach Ubuntu or Mint. Fedora aggressively embraces modern technologies like Wayland, Pipewire, BTRFs, Flatpak integration, security enhancements, containerization, and AI developer tooling. This makes Fedora feel incredibly modern and forward-thinking. In 2026, Fedora is arguably the cleanest implementation of the GNOME desktop environment. Everything feels polished, smooth, and elegant. Animations are fluid, multitasking is efficient, and Fedora often feels faster than Ubuntu despite using the same desktop environment. Fedora also benefits from very up-to-date software repositories. Developers love this because they gain access to newer compilers, programming languages, drivers, kernels, and development tools without needing unofficial PPAs or complicated workarounds. Security is another major strength. Fedora includes strong SI Linux integration, modern sandboxing technologies, and secure defaults that make the system extremely robust. Developers, system administrators, cybersecurity professionals, and Linux power users often prefer Fedora because it balances modern software with strong stability. Fedora Workstation also integrates beautifully with Flatpak applications and containerized workflows. If you are working with Podman, Docker alternatives, Kubernetes, machine learning environments, or cloud-native tools, Fedora feels incredibly powerful. Gaming performance on Fedora has improved massively too. A few years ago, Fedora was sometimes considered less gaming-friendly compared to Ubuntu-based systems, but that has changed dramatically. Proton works great, Steam installation is straightforward. Mesa drivers are often newer than Ubuntu's, and AMD GPU users especially love Fedora because they receive cutting-edge graphics stack improvements very quickly. Fedora's newer kernels also help support the latest hardware faster than conservative distributions. However, Fedora is not always the easiest choice for beginners. Some proprietary codecs require additional setup through RPM Fusion repositories. NVIDIA driver installation has improved, but can still feel slightly less beginner-friendly than Ubuntu or Pop! _OS. Fedora also moves fast, which means occasional updates can introduce small issues earlier than conservative distros. While Fedora is generally stable, it expects users to be somewhat comfortable learning Linux concepts. Beginners can absolutely use Fedora, but Mint and Ubuntu usually require less troubleshooting overall. And finally, we reach Pop_OS, the distro that became legendary among gamers, developers, creators, and laptop users. Developed by System 76, Pop_OS started as an Ubuntu-based distro, but evolved into something much more ambitious. In 2026, Pop_OS is one of the most exciting Linux distributions because of its unique cosmic desktop environment and strong focus on productivity. Unlike traditional GNOME implementations, Pop_OS introduces advanced tiling window management, keyboard-driven workflows, smart workspace organization, and extremely polished multitasking features. One reason Pop_OS exploded in popularity is because it solved Linux gaming frustrations better than many competitors. NVIDIA support became one of its biggest selling points because users could simply download the NVIDIA ISO and get working drivers immediately after installation. For gamers tired of driver headaches, that simplicity was game-changing. Steam, Proton, Lutris, Heroic Games Launcher, and gaming peripherals generally work extremely well on Pop_OS. Combined with excellent hardware scheduling and smooth desktop performance, Pop_OS became a favorite among Linux gamers and streamers. Developers also love Pop_OS because of its workflow efficiency. Tiling windows automatically organize applications, keyboard shortcuts boost productivity, and the overall experience feels optimized for people who spend hours coding, multitasking, or managing multiple monitors. The Cosmic Desktop has matured significantly and now feels distinct from GNOME while maintaining modern design principles. System 76 has invested heavily into making the desktop environment fast, responsive, and independent from GNOME limitations. Laptop support is another massive advantage. Pop_OS handles hybrid graphics switching beautifully on laptops with integrated and dedicated GPUs. Battery optimizations are solid, suspend behavior works well, and many users feel Pop_OS offers one of the best Linux laptop experiences available. This matters because Linux laptops in 2026 are becoming increasingly common among students, developers, and remote workers. But Pop_OS is not perfect either. Since it is more specialized, its ecosystem is smaller than Ubuntu's. Tutorials specifically for Pop_OS are less common, though Ubuntu guides usually work because of the shared base. Some users may also find tiling workflows overwhelming initially. And because Cosmic is evolving rapidly, occasional bugs or inconsistencies can appear as the desktop matures. Still, Pop_OS has become one of the strongest Linux distributions for power users who want performance, productivity, and gaming in one package. Now the biggest question remains, which distro is actually the best for 2026? The truth is that there is no universal winner because the answer depends entirely on the type of user you are. If you are an absolute beginner coming from Windows and want the safest, easiest, most frustration-free Linux experience possible, Linux Mint is probably the best choice. It feels familiar, stable, lightweight, and easy to understand. Mint minimizes confusion better than almost any distro available today. If you want maximum compatibility, massive community support, enterprise-level software availability, and the largest Linux ecosystem overall, Ubuntu remains incredibly hard to beat. Whether you are a student, developer, creator, or casual user, Ubuntu gives you access to the biggest Linux knowledge base on the internet. That ecosystem advantage alone keeps Ubuntu dominant. If you love modern technologies, want cutting-edge Linux features quickly, prefer clean GNOME experiences, or work heavily in development and cloud-native environments, Fedora may honestly be the most exciting Linux distro in 2026. Fedora feels like the future of Linux desktops, and many enthusiasts consider it the perfect balance between innovation and stability. And if you are a gamer, multitasker, programmer, or productivity-focused power user who wants a highly optimized desktop workflow with fantastic hardware support, Pop_OS is absolutely one of the best Linux experiences you can install today. It combines gaming friendliness, developer power, and workflow optimization in a way very few distros manage successfully. What is truly fascinating is how far Linux itself has evolved. A few years ago, Linux desktop users constantly struggled with Wi-Fi drivers, broken games, missing software, and terminal-heavy setups. But in 2026, Linux feels more polished than ever. Gaming works shockingly well thanks to Proton and Vulkan. AI tools are becoming Linux native. Content creators have access to better software than ever before. Laptop support is improving rapidly. Even companies that once ignored Linux are now supporting it officially. Choosing between pop_OS, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and Fedora no longer means choosing between working and broken. Instead, it means choosing between 4 genuinely excellent operating systems designed for different priorities. Another important factor is software distribution. Linux packaging systems changed dramatically over the past few years. Ubuntu pushes snaps, Fedora embraces Flatpak strongly. Mint prefers Flatpak while resisting Snap, and pop_OS mixes approaches while focusing on usability. These packaging systems allow users to install modern software independently from distro repositories, which reduces compatibility issues significantly. This means distro choice matters slightly less than before because applications are becoming more universal across Linux ecosystems. Wayland adoption is another huge change shaping Linux in 2026. Fedora aggressively pushed Wayland early and now benefits from one of the smoothest implementations. Ubuntu also transitioned heavily toward Wayland. Pop_OS continues optimizing its graphical stack, while Mint remains more conservative for compatibility reasons. Wayland improves security, touchpad gestures, fractional scaling, multi-monitor support, and graphical smoothness, but some older applications still behave better on X11. Distros differ significantly in how aggressively they embrace this transition. Hardware support is also evolving rapidly because Linux hardware vendors are finally taking desktop Linux seriously. Companies like Lenovo, Framework, Dell, and System76 now ship Linux-compatible hardware directly. mGPU support on Linux is exceptional now, while NVIDIA support continues improving thanks to better driver integration and Wayland progress. Fedora and pop_OS often adopt newer kernels faster, helping new hardware users sooner, while Mint prioritizes long-term reliability. AI integration is becoming another major battlefield. Developers increasingly use Linux for local AI models, machine learning frameworks, coding assistants, and automation tools. Fedora and Ubuntu often gain access to the newest AI tooling, first because enterprise and developer ecosystems target them heavily. Pop_OS also performs strongly here because of its developer-centric design. Linux Mint can absolutely run AI tools too, but it focuses more on stability and traditional desktop usability rather than cutting-edge experimentation. Community culture matters too. Ubuntu communities are enormous and beginner-friendly, though sometimes divided over Canonical's decisions. Fedora communities are often technical and innovation-focused. Mint communities prioritize simplicity and helping new users transition smoothly. Pop_OS communities attract gamers, developers, and productivity enthusiasts. The community surrounding a distro can dramatically affect your experience because Linux users rely heavily on forums, documentation, tutorials, Reddit discussions, Discord servers, and community troubleshooting. One mistake many beginners make is assuming they must choose the perfect Linux distro forever. In reality, Linux is flexible. Many users distro hop for years before settling on favorites, and that journey itself teaches valuable Linux skills. The good news is that all 4 distros discussed today are excellent starting points. There is no terrible choice here. Your first Linux distro simply needs to help you enjoy the Linux experience enough to continue learning. So, if someone asked for the simplest possible recommendation in 2026, it would probably look like this. Linux Mint for beginners and older PCs. Ubuntu for universal compatibility and massive ecosystem support. Fedora for modern Linux innovation and developers. Pop_OS for gamers, creators, and productivity-focused users. Each distro wins in different categories. And honestly, the best Linux distro is often the one that matches your personal workflow rather than internet hype. What makes this competition exciting is that Linux desktop computing is finally becoming mainstream enough that these distributions are now competing on refinement instead of basic functionality. A decade ago, Linux users fought just to make things work. In 2026, users compare animation smoothness, workflow efficiency, AI integration, gaming FPS, battery optimization, and desktop polish. That evolution alone proves how far Linux has come. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. Whichever distro you choose, you are entering an ecosystem built around freedom, customization, privacy, performance, and community-driven development. Unlike locked-down operating systems controlled entirely by massive corporations, Linux allows users to shape their computing experience however they want. Whether you prefer the polished familiarity of Mint, the universal ecosystem of Ubuntu, the futuristic innovation of Fedora, or the productivity powerhouse that is Pop_OS, you are stepping into one of the most exciting eras desktop Linux has ever seen.